It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at AmericasVoiceNow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
Good morning, America. You're listening to America's Voice Now. We're in our third segment of 4 this morning, Thursday, the 24th of October. Obamacare has been in play for 24 days. People still can't sign in. People still can't sign up. The nation is going to be in trouble shortly because we do not have the ability to actually provide the insurance that is going to be the one stopgap for those people whose policies are being canceled across the country. Yesterday, Florida, 300,000 policies were canceled. Now, bear in mind, 300,000 policies means that probably double or triple that were people that lost insurance, right? Because policies are normally not for the individual, for the family in most cases. So when you canceled 300,000 policies in Florida alone, Pennsylvania, I think it was 100,000 were canceled. We're talking over 1 million policies have been canceled in the last month, with because the insurance companies are saying that your old policy no longer fits Obamacare's requirements, and so therefore you are now obligated to buy a new policy, and here's your new price, and it's almost always higher than the old price. And that's because they're forcing retirees and people who are in their 50s and 60s to buy maternity care. You got to be kidding me. I mean, the absurdity of that in and of itself is insane. What makes you think a one-size-fits-all plan fits America? We don't all have the same issues. We don't all have the same needs. When you're in the 50s, why do you need maternity care? Why do you need to have insurance that's going to cover the birthing of babies when you are beyond the age of making babies physically? It's insane. But again, Obamacare is not about health care. It's about control. It's about siphoning money away from America. And it is about giving them access to all of your information so that they can utilize that to build dossiers on every single American. That's the truth. All right. We're going to talk about Mr. Peter Schweizer's new book called Extortion: How Politicians Extract Your Money, Buy Votes, and Line Their Own Pockets. There is a book that's, and I saw an interview with Schweizer the other day, which was stunning. Congress is charging secret fees to land top committee posts. So, in other words, if you want to sit on a committee, and you want to sit on the committee for, let's say, energy or the environment, or you want to sit on the defense committee, or you want to sit on the national security committee, you've got to raise literally millions of dollars for the party. For the party. These are party dues. Now, this is both Democrats and Republicans, which is why I've been telling you that the difference between Democrats and Republicans is virtually non-existent. They only approach the same goal from different directions, but the goal is always the same: your subjugation and enslavement. End of argument. Nothing else matters. Everything else is smoke and mirrors and marketing. That's the truth. And so, basically, what you need to understand is these people are forcing, if you want a seat on an influential committee, which you can then use to get bribes, you've got to pay. And the way you pay is by raising money for the party. So you go out to these well-heeled investors and well-heeled people, and you get them to donate money, and then to the party, right? So let's say you collect $500,000 worth of, if you want to sit on the House Ways and Means or Financial Services Committee, they actually have a price list, ladies and gentlemen. $500,000. You've got to raise $500,000 and put it into the Republican National Committee coffers or the Democratic National Committee coffers in order to get onto the House Ways and Means and Financial Services Committees. They also have a member point system that rewards the members for attending party fundraisers. So for showing up, Mr. Rawles is on with us. We're going to take a quick break. Hang on one second. I'm going to bring Mr. Rawles onto our phone line. Good morning, Mr. Rawles.
Yes.
Good morning, sir. How are you?
Just fine. Are we on the air?
We are. Thank you very much for joining with us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
You know, and this kind of came as a surprise through Dennis the other day, so I wasn't really planning on having you on today, but I am so grateful that you're able to join us. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
You know, I read your book, Patriots, just about a month ago, and I got to tell you, it was more than stunning and more than it gave me a lot of pause and a lot of thought. I've been perusing your blog, survivalblog.com, as well, and I have to tell you, you're doing a great service to this nation, one by writing this book and trying to prepare and educate people, but also by Survival Blog and continuing that effort. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Can you give us an idea of what kind of response that you've gotten from this book?
Well, my latest novel, Expatriates, came out the 1st of October. It hit number 21 on the New York Times bestseller list, and it's continued to sell quite well through Amazon and all the other major internet booksellers. It's now my third novel that's been on the New York Times bestseller list, and it's gratifying to see that so many people kind of resonate with this book. And I think that it's a good book for the current times because we kind of are on a economic precipice at this point.
Yes, we are. You know, the idea of some of the concepts and what I really liked about this is that you interlace throughout this book, not just and it's a novel. I mean, for the folks who haven't read it, and I'm not sure about Expatriates, but I can tell you this: it's going to be on my order list along with Extortion from Mr. Schweitzer. But the idea of what you've written in here isn't just a function of some great stories, but
yeah, it's more or less a survival manual dressed as fiction.
Thank you.
Most people end up reading my books twice, the first time through for fun.
And the second time with a highlight marker, right?
Yeah, highlighter, exactly.
And the truth of the matter is, I haven't highlighted this one because a friend lent it to me, and I can't do that to him. But I can tell you, actually, maybe I should do it to him and then give it back to him, all marked up, right? He won't have to do it himself. But you know, the idea of going through this book a second time is exactly where my intention is, to now go through it with a highlighter and mark it all up, but my own version, my own copy. And you're absolutely right. It is a survival manual in the form of fiction. And that's one of the things that I've encouraged our listeners to do, is get a hold of this book and read it that way, but mark it up as you go so you can get it the first time around. And then when you go through the second time, you can pick up anything you missed.
Right.
You know, the value of this and the teaching that goes into this book, and then combining that with visiting your, survivalblog.com, in my opinion, is probably one of the most important things that we can do as individuals and family members. You know,
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Well,
yeah, and I do recommend that people visit my blog site, even if they don't have any interest in fiction whatsoever. Everything at my blog site is free. It's been up for almost 8 years now. So, and it's been posted every day for 8 years. So
right.
It's the equivalent of 9,000 pages if you were to print it all out.
Holy smokes.
It's a tremendous amount of information. It's all fully searchable, and there's no special super secret password required or anything. It's all free of charge.
You mean the NSA can check it and they don't even have to break the code?
That's right. I do recommend that people, find the topics that interest them, and they print out the most important articles for their own reference binder. There's a lot of very useful, tactical, practical tips in there.
Sure. Well, look, one of the things that America's Voice Now promotes the most heavily is getting involved and being an active part of a grassroots effort. We want people to, I want people to sit and run for city council and state representative and school board and things like that. And we push that kind of stuff very heavily here. And while we talk about grassroots efforts in terms of contacting your representatives and your senators, which, at least on the federal level, seems to not have much of effect at all. But while we're doing that and trying to fight for the restoration of our Constitution into its rightful place in our country again, we also have to be cognizant of the fact that we may not be successful and that, our best efforts may not be enough, right?
Yeah, one of the themes that runs all through my writings is always have a plan B and a plan C.
Right.
I too, am a big believer in the political process, and I think that we ought to fight for restoration of our constitutional government as hard as we can, using the existing avenues that we still have available. But as kind of a backup, it's been said that our liberty is protected by 4 boxes. You've probably heard that quote many times.
Yes.
We're protected by the ballot box and by the jury box, and I guess the last resort, though, is the cartridge box.
Exactly, the ammo box. And,
right.
and the truth of the matter is, that's why such a heavy push is on right now to get firearms out of the hands of everyday Americans, because they recognize that would be, with that move, if they could only accomplish that goal, that we would be so far gone at that point that, complete and totalitarian or authoritarian rule would be an easy step. It would be the final. Right now, they recognize that it would be a very, very difficult move to try to slide us into the final steps of authoritarian rule. And
that's right, because we do have an armed citizenry and a competent citizenry. We have whole generations of people that have come back from wars overseas, most recently in Iraq and Afghanistan. We're really a force to be reckoned with, and I don't think anyone would have a prayer of instituting a totalitarian government in this country with the citizenry that we have.
As long as we've got access to the ability to defend ourselves, even on the on the small arms level.
Right.
Part of the goal of what we do is to not only drive that grassroots effort, but to make sure that folks are completely and thoroughly prepared, not only for their own protection and their own family and their own home, but in their communities as well. And a couple of the things that come out of Patriots, and I haven't read Expatriates, but you and I are going to have a discussion at the end of this about me getting one. But one of the areas that comes out of Patriots is, or the areas of study that comes out of that, is how community needs to work together, because no man is an island, and no man and his family are an island either. It's virtually impossible for one person to say this, I'm going to shelter in place in my own little fortress kind of mentality. It's really just not possible.
Human fatigue alone is just by itself is enough of a limiting factor. You can't be on watch 24/7, 365 days a year. It's just not going to happen. And in a survival situation where you're worrying about feeding yourself as well, with all the tasks that would be involved with gardening and small livestock,
of
you
course,
really need to have at least 2 or 3 families working together cooperatively. What you're going to need is a neighborhood watch on steroids.
Right, exactly. An armed neighborhood watch on steroids.
Right.
The Oath Keepers have recently come out with that program. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but they've announced the program that is kind of geared towards the community watch, program. Mm-hmm. And have you seen that?
Yeah, I read about that. I think they're calling it civilization sustainment teams.
Civilization preservation teams.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good approach, and I'm really glad to see them take it to that level, because it may very well come to that in the very near future.
Well, in the meantime, too, they're certainly applicable even in today's environment right now. I mean, I'm in Missouri, and recently you heard about the tornado that occurred over in Joplin. There's a perfect example there. Part of the concept of these community teams is that you have someone who's got a skill set in engineering and another one who's got a skill set in maybe electrical or whatever the case may be. And it's not just necessarily a question of, a national collapse, but even in a situation like that in Joplin where you had a storm or a tornado or a flood or whatever, hey, we've got to get sewage running again. We've got to get water back running again. We've got to be able to get electricity back on again. We've got to get communications lines back up. We've got to get our schools back into play. And these skill sets are things that we can use on an everyday basis. When you talk about that flood they had in Colorado a month ago, they're still reeling from that. And, these civilization preservation teams, as they're called, can also be used on a localized basis, but right now when you need them. You don't have to wait, in other words.
Right, and I think it's foolish to think that the government will be able to step in and handle all these things. I've often been quoted as saying that FEMA doesn't stand for what normally what people think it stands for. It actually stands for foolishly expecting meaningful aid.
I love that.
Yeah, the government just isn't going to be there. We're going to have to depend on ourselves, and I think that's one reason. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina and all these other disasters like Superstorm Sandy and what we saw happen in Japan with Fukushima, people have come to the realization that the government cannot handle it. We really are on our own, and I think that's the reason that the preparedness movement has really taken off.
Sure. Well, and I think it's more, too, than a lot of people think of preparedness as, well, let me just keep some food around the house and that kind of thing. But it's more than that. It happens to be, this community concept where, I'm not a mechanic. I don't know the first thing about mechanics. I can spell it, but that's about where my experience stops. But, there are people who are very good at that, and then there are things I'm good at that they need, and so forth and so on. And working together as a community, in my opinion, is probably one of the best advantages that we can give ourselves as we move forward in making sure that we're thoroughly prepared for whatever may come, whether that's local, whether that's regional, or whether it's national, or whether it's global in scope.
Mm-hmm. I think that really is a logical, rational, self-interest approach to life. It makes a lot of sense, and at the community level is the place it all has to start. If things fall apart, we're not going to expect things to be rebuilt from the top down. It's going to happen from the bottom up. Right,
and that is the truth. Let me get your thoughts, if we can kind of change gears for a moment, on some of the things that are currently happening right now in our day in and day out news cycle. The NSA is pretty large in terms of our viewpoint. What are your thoughts on that and the concepts that surround that?
Well, I guess I should preface by saying I'm a former Army intelligence officer, and I worked in the signals intelligence arena. So I know the field pretty well, although my personal knowledge is a little bit dated. I was an officer in the 1980s and early 90s, but suffice it to say that the technology exists to basically monitor every communication in the United States, at least, if not the whole world. And we have to operate with the assumption that all of our communications are being monitored, and we also have to operate with the assumption that basically every encryption system can be broken. So with those assumptions, my advice to people is to kind of go old school. My advice is to get back into the habit of writing letters,
right?
And putting them in an envelope with sticking on a stamp and dropping it in the mail. Although nowadays we've learned that part of the government snooping has been co-opting the Postal Service into photographing the outside of every envelope,
right?
And that's all scanned and in a giant database somewhere. So my advice is, when you're addressing an envelope, put the addressee's name both in the center of the envelope and in the upper left-hand corner, so they can't build a database of who's mailing who.
Oh, that's a good idea. Right. In other words, use their address, their delivery address, as the return address. So
exactly.
It looks like you're mailing it to yourself.
Right.
Or the recipients.
So, other than the postmark, they might be, if you live in some really small town, they might be able to piece that together. But otherwise, that is really the last bastion of long-distance communications that we have that's secure. Otherwise, it has to all be face-to-face.
I mean, if
we go by those assumptions that all of our communications are being monitored, everything electronic is essentially like writing a postcard where someone can read the back of the postcard. then I think we can operate in relative security by working around the monitoring. And I just don't want to see a situation develop where people get so paranoid because of the monitoring that they clam up and they drop out of the political process. Because if that happens, the bad guys have won.
Right. Well, one of the concerns and the things that I talk about on a routine basis here with our listenership is that part of the problem is that when you look at what the NSA is doing in gathering these files on individuals and building dossiers on people, right? Not groups now, but people. And then interconnecting those, under the 6 degrees of separation kind of principle. And then we have the incorporation of Obamacare, which then forces you, mandated by law, to turn over all this personal information and give them the aspects or the tabs in the file that they're missing, like your healthcare records and your financial records and, all of these other things. My biggest concern with this is that I don't think most Americans grasp the concept that at some point in time when these dossiers are built, nothing beneficial can come from that for the individual's benefit. In other words,
it's all dilatory to our personal liberty when you come right down to it. And unfortunately, the government's mandate with the NSA is to collect foreign intelligence to protect Americans from, the mad bombers overseas. But they kind of took the ball and ran with it, and they reserved the right to gather raw data, intelligence on every communication in the United States, and claiming, we'll just filter it all out later, and anything that pertains to United States citizens we'll ignore. Well, it doesn't work that way.
Right.
Obviously, they are building dossiers on us, and my advice is to just redouble our efforts to regain our liberty. We need to restore our constitutional republic, and we need to basically send these rascals packing. We need to turn out the politicians who are career politicians and get back to the whole concept of single-term politicians who are there as statesmen rather than as careerists.
Right. When we talk about the upcoming Obamacare, the problem that I see with that is that by participating in that, you're actually giving all of the other information, the missing piece, if you will, to the government for them to build and develop these files. And I call them dossiers, but I mean you can call them whatever you want. But
I like to call them Stasi files because it's a lot like what the East German secret police developed on all their citizens.
Yeah, but I think the East German secret police would have been, happy to have the capability, the technological capability we have today.
They had newspaper files on everyone. In fact, they had linear miles of files when the Berlin Wall came down. They were discovered, and they had everyone, gleefully informing on their neighbors.
Right.
Yeah, the Stasi would be thrilled to have this all in a giant electronic database with instant recall and with instant cross-correlation. It's kind of a frightening prospect when you come right down to it.
I don't think a lot of folks recognize that the federal model is exactly what you referenced a moment ago, which was the tattletale model. And I don't think that they realize the implication, because I hear people say, well, what do I care what the NSA's what are they going to do? Listen to me talking to my grandmother about the babies pictures, or me talking about my cat to my best friend? I mean, it's really not a big deal. I don't care. I don't do anything wrong. And what I don't think they realize is that it's not necessarily what you do wrong. It's what you do. It's the person that you're communicating with, the person who they're communicating with, the person that they're communicating with, that ultimately leads back to you, because these circles of contact, you don't know who's communicating with whom 3 people or 4 people down the line, and ultimately you're implicated just by contact or connection to those people.
Right. That means not only is the bad guy going to prison, but so is Kevin Bacon. Right?
Exactly.
So, you've heard the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon joke.
Right.
It's true. Yeah. They've created these webs of dossiers that all interconnect, and the full implications of it are beyond frightening.
But see, the Fed's model is to then take somebody who they feel that they can compromise by threatening them with incarceration or prosecution or whatever, and say, but we'll withhold that if you give us the names of the people who have weapons in their home or food stored or have spoken out against the government in some way, shape, or form. And I mean, we've seen every totalitarian network that's ever existed who utilizes that same tactic. And I think most Americans they don't get it, because we've never been exposed to it, and unless they've been involved in somehow with the legal system in this country, they don't even realize that that's a functional method.
Mm-hmm.
So
the way I like to look at it is, when you look at every state capital, imagine a dungeon underneath, because that's effectively what they have. We have a huge prison system in this country, and it could just as well be converted into political prisons. They could turn out the common criminals and use those prison beds to house political
dissidents,
opponents.
Yeah,
it's not beyond the realm of imagination.
Well,
so we need to be on guard.
When we look at things like the National Defense Authorization Act and that type of thing, where we've seen. And we still don't even know who they're holding under that. They've actually never really released that information. They've been questioned about it, but they, artfully avoid the answer. We don't even know if there are Americans who are currently being held under that.
Yeah, and these are not all Americans with Islamic surnames either.
No. I mean, all you have to be is classified as a belligerent, right? And
right.
Belligerence could take the form of telling a law enforcement officer no in a protest, you won't step back, to being a member of some plot. Let me ask you about the idea of where we stand with this petrodollar. The news is out yesterday that the Saudis are cutting diplomatic ties with us, and as you're probably aware, the petrodollar is probably one of the major pillars propping up the United States dollar as the world's reserve currency.
The real risk comes if the Saudis insist on settlement for oil contracts in euros or in Chinese yuan or in gold. It could spell the absolute doom of the U.S. dollar. In fact, I'm really surprised to see the dollar holding up as well as it has. I think the dollar probably would have collapsed several years ago if it weren't for the fact that the euro is in even worse shape.
Well, when we look at the dollar being the world's reserve currency, if the petrodollar agreement that we have with the Saudis, which is, we'll provide them defense and keep those monarchies in place as long as they make sure that everybody has to denominate their purchases in U.S. dollars. If that agreement falls apart, we're talking about not only the world's reserve currency being eviscerated, but also, and the United States losing the status of world reserve currency with the U.S. dollar. But we're talking about the complete and utter financial collapse of the dollar. Yes,
that's what I warned about in my novel Patriots, and I actually wrote the first draft of that novel back in 1990. And when I was writing about a default on U.S. Treasury debt and a collapse of the value of the dollar, back then people were saying I was crazy, that would never happen. But look at the times we're in now. It's closer than it ever has been.
Yesterday, the news was out that the Department of Homeland Security has spent $80 million preparing for civil unrest in upstate New York to protect the IRS and other government buildings from riots and civil unrest and things like that. And that's the latest in a long history of news articles that have come out about the DHS buying high volumes of ammunition, buying up a lot of medical supplies and things like that. What are your thoughts on the DHS and how they're...
All we can hope for there is the incompetence of government. If they were really good at what they were doing, then I would be quite concerned. And the other thing to consider is when you read these articles about these massive purchases of ammunition, those are usually what are called IDIQ contracts, which is indefinite quantities, where basically they're trying to get the very most for the taxpayer dollar.
Right.
So they say, well, we may buy up to 50 million rounds of ammunition, but it may only turn out to be a 100,000 round ammunition order that gets placed.
But my concern is that they're actually shorting.
It's dangerous to look at these in aggregate numbers because
I wouldn't disagree, but I believe that they're actually shorting the commercial marketplace in an effort to try to keep ammunition out of the hands of Americans.
That may actually be the case. I don't know. It's hard to say. All I know is that there's definitely shortages of ammunition right now. Yeah, most people don't realize that FEMA's main job is not disaster relief. It's actually continuity of government.
Right.
They have huge holdings of supplies that are actually there to keep government operating rather than supporting the citizenry in the event of a disaster. They want to keep the government up and running and functional, and they have huge infrastructure of communications, a huge infrastructure of storage food, reserve facilities for housing government officials. That's their main job. Their secondary job is disaster relief. And they actually have a fairly large black budget for continuity of government that it doesn't even show up on the main budget line items for FEMA.
I get a lot of...
And the DHS is branching out the same way. They're, just as you pointed out.
It's mission creep taken to a dangerous degree, I believe. Mm-hmm. I get a lot of requests from folks to talk about, and do homework and research on FEMA, the argument of the FEMA camps and things like that. And I'd like your thoughts on that. I personally, I don't know what to make of it, and I don't know whether or not I see and hear all kinds of things. And
as I mentioned before, a lot of these FEMA facilities are actually continuity of government facilities, and they have earmarked some facilities for, holding camps. Now, are those legitimate camps for refugees, or are they planning to lock people up? It's not really clear. But I do think again, by looking at all these numbers in aggregate form, we're actually overstating the infrastructure that exists.
Well, I saw
a lot of these camps have come and gone, and yet they're still listed on these
That's true.
websites.
That is the truth.
FEMA camps.
Yeah, I've heard, and I've seen people who have said, here's a Google satellite photo shot of that area where you say a FEMA camp's supposed to exist. It's 3 months old, and there's nothing there but trees. So I agree with you there. Right. But I had seen that report from the Pentagon that was that actually had a map and a plot plan for facilities where they had interrogation rooms and all of these kinds of things, and it was modeled exactly after the federal prison system, but broken up into these 1/8 kind of segments where this facility was designed to handle 5,000 people. Wow. When you look at that, and I'll be more than happy to share that document with you if you'd like, but when you look at that, and you look at the map, and this is in a Pentagon's own documentation. I mean, this isn't something somebody made up. That's kind of terrifying to us when we look at, and it's labeled interrogation room. I mean, that doesn't leave a whole lot to the paranoid imagination, if you will. They're pretty much telling you what that's for.
And a lot of this actually dates back 30 years or more. You may recall during the Oliver North hearings, more than a decade ago now, almost 15 years ago now, they were talking about Rex 84, which is Readiness Exercise 1984,
right?
Where they were talking about, at the time, they were more presumably and presumptively talking about refugees coming in from Cuba and having to house large numbers of people. And the other scenario was having to house large numbers of war protesters in the event that they had to reinstitute the draft. But a lot of this planning has been going on for years and years, and a lot of it was done originally by FEMA.
Yeah. As we move forward, it's apparent that, clearly they have a plan that we're not privy to, and that it doesn't necessarily bode well for us, irrespective of how it plays out. I think the average American can walk away with the idea that we're on the wrong list. Not the, it may be the short list.
There's only one list. We're all on it. Just some of us are a little closer to the top than others.
Well, that's probably true, but I mean, there's the good list to be on, and that's, you're a friend of government, and then there's the bad list to be on, which is the rest of us. When we look at things like Agenda 21, and we read some of the documentation that comes out of that about overpopulation and some of that kind of thing, that stuff is very frightening, especially to my listeners. I get requests to do homework and do programs on things like that, things like this new IMF story I talked about yesterday, where they're talking about literally going in and extracting and confiscating 10% of anybody's wealth globally who has a positive cash flow or a positive net value. That kind to pay off government debt, in whatever respective country you live in. So, they do a balance sheet on you, and if you've got positive wealth, they can capture 10% of your
levy 10% of it. Yeah,
exactly.
I would not be
Cyprus.
surprised to see, and I've mentioned in my blog, I would not be surprised at all to see Cyprus-style bail-ins in Europe first, and then in the United States and Canada. Let's face it, the people who are hungry for power are hungry for money first. And if they think that they can get away with it, they will go ahead and institute all forms of new taxes to try to extract wealth from the citizenry. And if they see the United States as a net debtor nation, one of the ways they may try to settle their debt is to levy the entire population.
Right. Your thoughts on precious metals, and I'm not one of these guys who I don't have any advertisers. I don't have any vested interest in it one way or the other. I guess
I actually am a fairly big believer in precious metals, but I believe in getting your beans, bullets, and Band-Aids together first.
Bingo.
And then after you have that all squared away,
right,
I emphasize silver.
Right.
Physical silver in your personal possession. I prefer silver for two reasons. One is it's much more
tradable.
Much more tradable, right? It's much better suited for barter. I mean, what would you buy with an ounce of gold? That would buy like an entire car or a whole year's worth of food. But when you need to do a barter transaction for a few cans of beans,
right? What are you going to do? Pull out tin snips?
More sense than a Krugerrand.
Right.
The other reason I like silver is that it's far less likely to be confiscated by the government if we ever have another confiscation like they had in 1934 with gold.
Right.
The logistics of calling in just the gold alone would be daunting, but to call in all the silver by volume and by weight, there's 60 times more
silver out there,
more silver out there than there is gold.
Right.
So it'd be impossible to call it all in, and I think they'll probably ignore it. So if you're sitting on a whole bunch of pre-1965 dimes, quarters, and half dollars, you'll probably be fine. But if you have 3 or 4 Krugerrands, you may be in trouble.
Sure. My personal belief on it is that I think we're, probably the best items for barter will be food, medical supplies, and ammunition and weaponry.
Amen.
I encourage my listeners, because we live in a pretty rural area here, and I encourage my listeners, both local and national, to look forward first and foremost towards taking care of your family, and then make sure that you've got extra medical supplies on hand. Because I have to tell you, I think most people are vastly unprepared in terms of the medical aspect of things. And
yes, they tend to be. People tend to go really heavy on guns, ammunition, and communications equipment, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But they often don't have near enough food storage, and in most cases, do not have near the medical supplies they'll need.
Right.
And they don't really look at things in the long term of just, how much bandaging material you're going to need. And
well, just plain antibiotics. I mean, we're so accustomed.
Yeah.
We live in a nation where everybody puts on that little alcohol pump on their hand. And we live in a place where we're not accustomed to disease, and yet in Syria they've got these polio is back. Can you believe it? Polio is back in Syria, and it's spreading like wildfire. They have this new flesh-eating disease that they're getting from lack of hygiene, and we're in a nation where we've kind of eradicated all these basic concerns that we have about, and we live in a very antiseptic society. I think a lot of us are really probably more wide open to being attacked by, dangerous, parasites and
Sure.
viruses and bacteria.
In our pampered society, we also have a society that has no concept of third world living standards. So if the power grid were to go down, people would not be able to revert. At least in third world nations, they're used to the power going out every day.
Or they don't have any at all.
They know how to live. They know how to handle their own sanitation. But here in the States, people would have no clue, and it would be a sanitation, public health nightmare overnight.
Agreed. What would we do without flush toilets? People wouldn't have any idea what to do. They're afraid to go camping in the woods.
They'd be fouling the water upstream of people gathering drinking water.
Exactly. So, well, I'm so grateful and appreciative that you joined with us this morning. I'd like to.
Thank you so much for having me on. I hope that your listeners get a chance to check out my blog. Again, it's survivalblog.com, and all the content there is available free.
Outstanding. And I strongly encourage our listeners to get a hold of Expatriates, which I will also be grabbing a hold of shortly. And then if you have an opportunity to, and you can get a hold of the original Patriots, that would be, what was the title, if I may ask, of the first book that you had written? You mentioned this was the third.
The first book was Patriots. The second novel was Survivors. The third novel was Founders. The fourth novel is Expatriates, which talks about Americans overseas. And I'm working on another novel right now that will be coming out next October that will be titled Liberators, and it will be set primarily in Canada. But they're all set in the same time period. I've also written a nonfiction book called How to Survive the End of the World as We Know It, which has been a bestseller from Penguin. And I'm writing another book for Penguin, which will be out next May, called Tools for Survival.
Do you have like a package where people could jump on to survivalblog.com and buy these as a collected group?
Actually, no. Unfortunately, I don't, and I've had several different publishers, so that really isn't possible. But they are all available at all the major internet booksellers, and for anybody who's one of those secret squirrels who doesn't want to have a paper trail buying controversial books, they're available at most bookstores. You can pay cash, or you can find them at most gun shows. Any of the booksellers at gun shows usually have all of my books.
Right. Well, again, thank you so much for joining with us. We're building a video studio, by the way, and I'd love to, and I'll talk with you a little bit further about that offline. I'd love to have you come on our new video program that we're developing, and I'll be more than happy to have you back on with us as a guest for the benefit of our listeners. I'm very, very appreciative that you've joined with us this morning. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me on, and God bless.
God bless. Have a great day. Ladies and gentlemen, that was our new friend and kind of a guy that I've respected and admired from afar for a while. His name is James Wesley Rawles. He is the author of numerous books, and the number one, I'd say the number one survival blog on the web. It's called survivalblog.com. He is an signal intelligence or intelligence officer, and he writes his books, which are fiction, with the concept that they're more geared or aligned towards the idea of being used as survival manuals, but they're incorporated into a fiction story. So I would strongly encourage you to get a hold of them. I just recently read Patriots. I had a friend of mine hand this to me to take a look at. I'm going to actually go through it a second time, and I'm going to make sure that I go through it with a highlight marker. I strongly encourage you to do the same, and it is an excellent opportunity for new ideas and concepts to be triggered about what are the implications. You know, we all think about what would happen if there was a national emergency or a disaster or a flood or a famine or a whatever, a drought, a storm, a tornado in our area. This gives you, in the form of fiction, some very practical ideas to think about that will help you to at least formulate in your own mind, hey, I hadn't thought of that aspect of it, or I hadn't thought of this idea or this technique, or I hadn't thought of this particular method. He goes through in these books and provides some very, very good insight into some tactical applications that you might want to know about. And so I would strongly encourage you to get a hold of these books. In fact, I think I'll talk to him about maybe making them available on America's Voice Now, and maybe what we'll do is we'll sell them as a bundle. That way, it doesn't matter who the publisher is. And in addition to that, make sure that you visit his blog, which is called survivalblog.com. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we're going to take on our last topic, which is the issue of what's going to happen with canceled insurance as we move forward. We do know that millions of Americans are having their insurance canceled, and as a result, what that's going to mean for us as a nation, because as Obamacare is not available, these folks who already had insurance but are now being canceled and their insurance policies will end effectively January 1, they're going to be caught literally without any insurance whatsoever. And I got to tell you, when you look at the implications of that, there are folks who are going to be literally in a position where they're involved in a medical treatment plan. They have surgery pending. They have all kinds of issues, or they have chronic illness where their medication is going to be cut off. Their access to their doctor is going to be cut off unless they pay cash. I got to tell you, I smell literally hundreds of billions of dollars worth of lawsuits coming on this, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. You're listening to America's Voice Now. Please make sure that you have an opportunity to join with us, and you can capture our show every day on our website where we stream it live at AmericasVoiceNow.org. You can also find us on Facebook at Facebook.com/America's Voice Now. And then we post every show that we do up on YouTube, where you can find them on our YouTube channel at YouTube.com/America's Voice Now. If you'd like to communicate with me directly, I'd love to hear from you, good or bad. You can reach me via email by contacting me at Mike at America's Voice Now. That's Mike at AmericasVoiceNow.org. Please make sure you write that email address down. If you'd like to hear special types of topics on shows, let me know what they are. If you've got feedback on one show or another, let me know what it is. It helps me to do a better job of providing what you want, while at the same point in time giving me critical feedback I need. We'll be back in just a moment. Stick with us.